This is the film and videotape vault of the international news film organisation Viz News. It holds 20,000 hours of material. That's 50 million feet of film. From 1896 to the present day, virtually every major event is here, somewhere. You can watch the monarch being crowned anytime you care to screen the film. Which monarch? Well, you can take your choice from 24. And long-gone cricketers are as sprightly replayed here as if it were only yesterday that they were captured forever on film. It was here and in vaults like this that the search was made for the film that you're just going to see. Let's go now and meet the man who conducted it and discovered all these treasures, David Frith. David, hello, how are you?
Hello.
David, the first question must be, how did you manage to make such a magnificent collection?
Well, it was a search that went on for at least 2 years, looking through national film archives in Britain and Australia, looking at the newsreel stock, and also collecting from private sources.
Did you have any particularly spectacular surprises?
Well, all along the line, the 1898 group, as they walked past the camera, that was a big thrill, discovering that. W.G. Grace at the nets, Ranjit Singh at the nets, some of the 1920s material, Trumper's funeral in 1915, Don Bradman in colour after his retirement, but it's the only colour, I think, that exists. The Phil Mead shuffle.
I wouldn't have thought anybody would ever have filmed that.
Yes, that was privately shot.
Tell me, how did you decide which batsman to include?
Well, many of them walked in automatically. Sobers and Grace and Bradman and Hammond and so on, your Jack Hobbs. But occasionally you came across a piece of film that was so good you had to include it. Charlie Kellaway, who once batted for 7 hours in a test match. I didn't think that there was film of him. Having discovered it, it's worthwhile. It goes in, as do so many other wonderful clips that you don't find until you search. And perhaps we could look at some of them now.
Yes, let's do that. Of course, it didn't quite begin here. In fact, you must wonder that cricket began in England at all when you can get an Arctic wind like this on a match day. But here in the 18th century, the cricketers of Hambledon so raised their game that this bald Hampshire down, as somebody once called it, became really the source of the history of cricket. The game that, to so many people, has become more than a game. And when Hampshire played All England, so Nyren recalled, half the county would be there, and all their hearts with us. Go hard, titch and turn, touch and turn as they took their runs. The crowd used to bay as Walker, Nyren, Small and Belden scored their runs for Hambledon. Silver Billy Belden, the man with that striking head of fair hair, who was a premier batsman in All England. Skills were refined as the game's techniques were tightened at the highest level. William Lambert made himself the champion batsman in the land and then fell from grace for taking a bribe to throw a match, or rather for being found out. Then came Fuller Pilch, from Norfolk to Kent and to national fame. Moving film was still half a century away, but the worldwide spread of the game was underway. Already old William Clark was exploiting the railway to take his all-star side to the remotest corners of Britain. And now cricketers, some of them, began to make money. The first team to venture abroad sailed off to tour North America in 1859. Another blazed the trail to Australia 2 years later. This is the earliest known photograph of an international cricket match. Victoria against the English 11 at the Melbourne Cricket Ground in January 1862. A strong lad from Gloucestershire made his mark early, a mark so deep and lasting that over a century later, he's as easily recognised as his Queen or Prime Minister Gladstone. An eminent Victorian in his own right, Dr. W.G. Grace may still be seen as the embodiment of cricket. And he may, as one biographer suggested, have remained intellectually always at the age of 16. He played for over 40 summers of first-class cricket, and so dominated the game that it was believed no batsman would ever even aspire to match his achievements. It seemed he might go on forever, for in 1895, when he was approaching 47 years of age, he scored 1,000 runs in May and notched his 100th century. He was the mightiest of the mighty. Captain of Gloucestershire, captain of the gentlemen, captain of England, in real terms the most highly paid amateur any sport has ever known. In 1898, he captained the gentlemen against the players in the showpiece match at Lord's on his 50th birthday. Proud to parade with him were the cream of the cricketers of the age. Shrewsbury, captain of the professionals. Stoddart and the tall William Gunn. Wicketkeeper Dick Lilly and robust Australian all-rounder Sammy Woods. Little Bobby Abel and Major Wynyard. Lofty John Tunnicliffe and the Honourable F.S. Jackson of Yorkshire. J.T. Hearn and Gregor McGregor. Storer, Dixon. Lockwood, the lordly Archie McLaren. Brockle and Townsend. Schofield Hay. Alec Hearn. J.R. Mason, Courtwright, the legendary fastest of them all, and Wilfred Rhodes, here a young tail ender, but soon an England #1. The golden age of cricket, or was it merely one of cricket's golden ages? At the beginning of this century, England had a most ferocious hitter in Gilbert Laird Jessup, the Croucher they called him, a short man but wide-shouldered and immensely strong. And he cracked a most spectacular 100 against the Australians in only an hour and a quarter here at the Oval, where, incidentally, Test cricket on English soil had begun in 1880. Jessup specialised in fast hundreds, made 15 inside the hour, and just 20 years after the historic upset of the Ashes Test here, he shook the Australians to their very boot spreeks when he created England's exciting victory with perhaps the most improbable century of them all. Style was character in the batsmen of that era. The elegance of Pallett, the amazing neatness of Reggie Spooner, the almost patrician dignity of R.E. Foster, who a year later was to score 287 in his first test. Regal McLaren held the world record with a score of 424 for Lancashire against Somerset in 1895. C.B. Fry was academic, almost scholarly in his batting. Ranji, orientally fluent. Jessup resembled none of these, but how he could hit. So could Ted Allison of Nottinghamshire, who once threatened the Hove Ground with demolition as he battered out 139 runs in half an hour. But Allison's was a one-off performance. Edwardians who gambled were safer with their money on tiny Bobby Abel of Surrey. Or the Lancastrian Johnny Tildesley, who displayed, according to Neville Cardus, batsmanship a fellow could understand. He made runs on hard pitches and wet ones alike, and there were plenty of rain-affected pitches around in those uncovered days. Australia had already made her presence felt with victory in the first Test match of all, in Melbourne. With shock successes at Lord's against the MCC in 1878 and in the 1882 Test at the Oval, which saw the creation of the Ashes as sporting grief and panic swept cricketing England. Charlie Bannerman in 1877 made Australia's first Test century. Billy Murdoch, the first Test double century in 1884. These colonial triumphs ensured that exchanges of tours became regular and usually well supported by the public.
Joe Darling, hiding behind the shrubbery, leads his Test men onto the field in England in 1905. Apparently in the excitement about being able to take their wives in those days, they forgot to take their razors. In this group, you will recognize a lot of old-timers.
The 1905 series went England's way, but Australian spirits remained high. That's if the clowning in this piece of film is anything to go by. There were batsmen in that team who could have challenged for places in any Australian side in history. Clem Hill, noble as an all-rounder, as well as Armstrong. Skipper Joe Darling and the legendary Victor Trumper, who'd broken records galore in 1902 and now in 1905 had his only known opportunity to demonstrate on film the grace and skill of his batting, wasted by a dismal throw from a teammate off camera. He had several strokes for every ball, but cared little for averages. When he died in 1915, he was only 37. Part of Australia died with him. Here at Waverley Cemetery in Sydney, Noble, McCartney and the bowler hat Tibby Cotter escort the hearse. George Giffen, the masterly South Australian all-rounder, Bonner, the hugest hitter of them all, Sid Gregory, first of that noble Australian clan, and the diligent Harry Graham, Lyons, the stupendous hitter, Reggie Duff, Trumper's regular opening partner. These were the batsmen who made Australia a cricketing power.
These are the last quiet moments our Australian visitors will have before they reach Dover and are greeted by the hordes of fans eager for the fray. They arrive at Waterloo and are officially received by Lord Hailsham, President of the MCC.
Their successors between the world wars, raised on hard, true pitches, were to lift their country's standing to even greater heights. Their centuries, double centuries, triple centuries, and even quadruple centuries.
Back in sunny Australia, in the line of Victor Trumper, there came Charlie McCartney, the Governor-General. Small, muscular, defiant. He liked to hit fast bowlers back over their heads. "I feel sorry for these poor coves who've got to bowl against me today," he'd warn with the utmost conviction. These precious clips are from his famous century before lunch in the Headingley Test of 1926, a year when, at the age of 40, he took hundreds off England's Test match bowling in 3 consecutive innings.
Oh dear, a short stay for Bardsley. But McCartney more than makes up for that. Look at him go. A 100 for McCartney and all before lunch.
Less genius than plain gifted was Warren Bardsley, a laconic, hard-practicing left-hander who, at the Oval in 1909, became the first to score 2 separate hundreds in a test match. 17 years later, back in London, he carried his bat through Australia's innings at Lord's for 193 not out. And he was 42. Warren Bardsley. Herbie Collins. Jack Ryder. Charlie Kellaway. Stork Hendry. Charlie McCartney. They all helped carry Australia to triumph after triumph during the 1920s, shepherded and bullied by their gargantuan captain, Warwick Armstrong.
Warwick Armstrong chats with Tom Garrett and Jack Blackham, veterans of the first test in 1877.
There was, too, the neat and effective batsmanship of Johnny Taylor, who was the favourite hero of the schoolboy Don Bradman. In South Africa, there was another Taylor, Herbie, whose class as a batsman was far above anything his Springbok contemporaries could offer. Here he introduces his 1924 team to King George V. And Dave Norse, tough and dependable, father of a future test player, seen here on the left. Here's Bob Cattrall, who made 2 centuries and a 95 against England in this 1924 series. And Jock Cameron, mighty striker as well as wicketkeeper, who died shortly after the 1935 tour of England.
What of the 1920s in England? Though the Great War remains sombre in memory, new growth was apparent. The greatest of opening pairs, Hobbs and Sutcliffe, impressed themselves into British subconsciousness. On so many occasions they stood together against all that Australia could hurl at them. Jack Hobbs, a modest, kindly Surrey acquisition from Cambridge, seen here with the older Tom Hayward, flicking off a bail. Hayward was Hobbs's first great partner, who was the first to emulate WG's Century of Centuries. But the comrade in arms who, with Hobbs, raised opening batting to the height of confidence and efficiency was Herbert Sutcliffe, the polished Yorkshireman, who played the game on his terms, if with an occasional stiffness. He was never intimidated, never lacking in courtesy, never flustered, not even when the ball hit his wicket in a test match. Hobbs and Sutcliffe, what a magnificent pair. Millions who never entered a cricket ground recognised them as symbols not only of English cricket, but of something English cricket had often lacked until then, a rock-like reliability.
Oh, well played. Single for Sutcliffe. Yes, it's gone all the way. A boundary off O'Reilly gives Sutcliffe his 50. What a great test player he is. There goes another boundary. Well played, Sutcliffe.
They said nobody would ever compare with W.G. Grace, though some conceded Ranjit Singh Ji might be a special case. Yet Jack Hobbs in his time completely satisfied his audiences. Never more than in 1925, when he first equalled and then passed W.G.'s record of 126 centuries. He'd been followed around for almost a month by the faithful crowds and the press. We got to 91 against Somerset at Taunton on a Saturday evening. The Sunday was the day of rest, calm as it might have been. Then, On Monday, the great moment approached. Ironically, after all the suspense, the cameraman was caught napping, and the stroke with which Hobbs reached his 100 had to be faked later. But not the gesture of his captain, Percy George Fender, who took him out a drink to celebrate. It was dry ginger ale. He'd done it. And the next day, when all the pressmen but one had departed, and the world had returned to normal, Jack quietly went out and made his second century of the match to take him clear of WG. Jack Hobbs played until his 52nd year. He finished with a record 197 centuries and another record 12 of them in tests against Australia. Later, much later in his blameless life, he was honoured by his monarch with a knighthood and with the gates at his home ground, Kennington Oval, which still bear his name.
Jack Hobbs is a proud man today because the Hobbs Gate at the Kennington Oval is being opened in his honour by Mr. Lucien Gore, President of the Surrey County Cricket Club. The erection of the gate is a tribute to the greatest living ex-England batsman.
English batsmanship of the 1920s will always be remembered for Hobbs and Sutcliffe and Frank Woolley, whose long and honourable career, like Jack Hobbs, began back in the Edwardian years. Affection for this most graceful and commanding left-hander extended far beyond the boundaries of Kent.
Well, what I liked about Victor Trumper was he got 100 against us. A beautiful 100, it was a good wicket, I admit, is when they got 600 against us. And I was then fielding cover, and as he's going out, I said, well, you know how to get out, won't you? He said, Frank, there are 3 good batsmen sitting in that pavilion as good as me. They want to knock, you know. He deliberately got out to give them a chance.
Andrew Sandham, here on the right, was a dapper opening batsman who was to outlive most of his friends and adversaries. He played uncomplainingly and with high skill in the companionable shadow of Hobbs, and once held the World Test record with an innings of 325 in 10 hours against West Indies at Kingston, Jamaica.
How tired? I'm tired all right, but feet were sore. I started off with some sore feet and a sore shin. I wore someone else's shoes because my own were tight, and they hadn't got anybody terribly fast, and the bowling to me didn't seem to be very troublesome. I went on next day after being in about 3 or 4 hours, and I called for another bat, and the captain sent his bat out, which was not the bat I would have chosen myself to play with. One it was a long handle bat for a start.
George Gunn, seen here on the left, his partner Larwood, was very much his own man. He played for England at 28 and at 50, taking on the fast bowlers from yards down the pitch or blocking soft half volleys when he wasn't in a hitting mood. A moody, unpredictable genius. J.W., young Jack Hearn, neat, sadly unrobust, but he made 96 centuries, 11 of them over 200, and all from Middlesex. Ernest Tildesley, remembered for one golden sequence in 1926 when he scored 7 centuries in 10 innings, the lowest of which was 51. Percy Chapman's style at the crease and in life was more carefree than most. He won the England captaincy at 25, won the Ashes, and won his next 8 tests before Bradman and company rolled over him like a steamroller. Percy Holmes, like Sandham, was usually edged out of the England 11 through the long-term lease of Hobbs and Sutcliffe. And there was another Percy, Fender, the cartoonist's delight. The century he tore out of the Northamptonshire attack in 1920 was the fastest ever played. It took 35 minutes. Charlie Hallows needed to score 232 runs on the last day of May 1928 to achieve the distinction of 1,000 runs before June. And he made them, though not with batsmanship like that. The most reliable left-hander of them all was Philip Mead. Certainly nobody ever made as many runs for one team as Mead did for Hampshire. 48,892. That meant a lot of ritual tapping. He went twice to Australia, on tours 17 years apart, and one city mayor in 1928 welcomed him as the son of the Mead of old. Nor should we forget that Wilfred Rhodes, when he wasn't taking wickets, was usually piling up runs. At Melbourne in 1912, he and Jack Hobbs put on 323 for England's first wicket against Australia. People seem largely to forget that Essex batsman, Jack Russell, but his record in Test cricket is 18 innings for England with 5 centuries. And Lancashire's tough little Harry Makepeace made a century for his country at Melbourne when he was nudging 40. Golden long ago summers, which left their warmth in the pavilion timbers of the land. In the fading decades of the British Empire, England's cricketers, the MCC teams that went to Australia and South Africa, India and West Indies, were the men from home. They sometimes had a hard time of it, but during the 1920s, Australia slowly lost their supremacy as their star players gave in to age. But in the time-honoured Australian tradition, Renaissance was but a summer or two away. Never has there been a contemporary quintet of batting talents collectively to match these Australians. Alan Kippax, master of the late cut, a stroke loaded with risk. Toured England when he was past his best, but he was a wristy, elegant stylist of the first order and a very high scorer. Archie Jackson, born in Scotland and taken to Sydney as a child, was Kippax's protégé and a rare prodigy. 2 centuries in a match for New South Wales when he was only 17. A valiant 164 at Adelaide on his Test debut against England in 1929 at 19. In 1930, when he toured England, the tuberculosis which was to end his life before his 24th birthday had already taken its lethal grip. No one since Trumper has come so close to matching his beauty of execution and his adaptability of style. That 1930 tour will always be remembered on one spectacular count. A young man from a bush town, Donald George Bradman, had made some phenomenal scores in Australia, including the new world record of 452 not out. But some fairly shrewd English judges thought his technique was too imperfect to prosper to the same degree on English pitches. Here are his scores in the 1930 Test matches. 8, 131, 254, probably the finest innings he ever played. 1, 334, a new Test record. 14, 232, making a total of 974 runs at an average of 139. Let us have a glimpse of some of those innings.
And here are Ponsford and Boy Bradman to resume the Australian second innings. Here's Tildesley bowling to Boy Bradman.
Then came the fierce assault of Bodyline, when England's fast bowlers, Larwood and Vose, bounced the ball at over 90 miles an hour in the general direction of the batsman's body, with a posse of close catchers posted on the leg side.
Cricket is like any other science. Let me explain. First, you have Bradman, an irremovable object. Then there was Larwood, an irresistible force. Now, it's a very simple rule of dynamics that when an irresistible force meets an irremovable object, well, something's apt to happen. But it was all much ado about nothing. For to echo the words of one far greater than I, the only thing they had to fear was fear itself.
Oldfield is now his partner, but the English players are very distressed when he is struck on the head, Larwood again being the unlucky bowler.
And Bertie Oldfield, the batsman nursing a fractured skull, wasn't all that ecstatic either. England were well satisfied when Bradman averaged only 56 in that acrimonious series. But Australian revenge came in 1934 on Bradman's second tour to England. This nuggety, very Australian young man with the eagle eye, perfect reflexes, and the appetite of a starveling for runs was the pride of all Australia through the Depression years and beyond.
Bradman and Ponsford in magnificent form shatter the hopes of the enormous Headingley crowd of getting cheap Australian wickets. Bradman has found his form at last. The score mounts rapidly with these two at the stumps, and here is Don's century. Bradman's 200. Bradman's 250. England are now in a deep depression, thanks to Bradman. Little man, you've had a busy day. Don's partnership with Ponsford is a record and leaves Australia in a winning position, 494 for 4. Well done, Bradman. England, what about it?
The crowd on the Sydney Hill loved him. And even the English, in a masochistic kind of way, took him to their hearts. On and on he went, through series after series, poor health and sound against pace and spin, and now with the added burden of captaincy. His presence at the crease added thousands to the gate takings. When he was out cheaply to the spinner, Clary Grimmett, in the Grimmett-Richardson testimonial match, Vic Richardson turned to the beaming bowler and said, "You've just cost us £1,000. And that may have been an understatement. On his third English tour in 1938, the mature Bradman was as commanding as ever, if a trifle less daring. At Trent Bridge, it was Stan McCabe who stole the show, playing one of 3 amazing test innings. This one amounted to 232. Against the Bodyline attack, he'd hit a brave and risk-taking 187 not out at Sydney. 3 years later, at Johannesburg, his 189 not out was so fiercely struck that the South African captain appealed against the light in the interests of his fieldsman's safety as storm clouds blew over the ground. Now, this match at Nottingham seemed lost until McCabe took over. Of the last wicket stand of 77 with Fleetwood Smith, McCabe cut, hooked and drove 72 imperious runs, a display that had even his record-breaking captain agape with admiration. War was round the corner, and this, together with foot trouble, shortened McCabe's memorable career. But Bradman, despite further poor health and post-war indecision, marched on, plaguing pre-war and post-war adversaries alike. It was enough to make all Australia dance with relief.
Don's wicket was eventually captured by Edrich, who clean bowled him. But this, unfortunately, was not until Don had made 187.
He became the first non-Englishman to score 100 centuries.
Don Bradman achieved new heights of brilliance when at the Sydney Cricket Ground he prepared to give the old-timers something to think about in the match against India. The reason wasn't far to seek. Don Bradman was about to reach his 100th century in first-class cricket. Here's a sample of his effortless style and brilliant timing, not forgetting a spectacular 6 to the grandstand. Here's how Don put 99 on the scoreboard, and the atmosphere grows tense. The next fateful ball, but the crowd needn't worry. Don makes it in a single, and the whole ground goes wild. A century of brilliant centuries, a real tonic for Australians old and young, and another milestone in a great sporting career.
And then came his final English tour.
We are very glad indeed. In fact, I cannot tell you how delighted we are to be back in England once again. We're very anxious to get on shore and get on with the business.
A triumphant procession from spring to autumn 1948. Australia undefeated through the entire season. For Bradman, a stream of runs and victories, applause, admiration, and an ever-increasing sense of awe. And eventually, a knighthood.
As a cricketer, he was given a copy of Plum's book on Lords and a truly magnificent birthday cake.
Cricket has a mischievous habit of scripting ironies, and one was reserved for Don Bradman. In his final test match, needing only 4 runs to finish with a test total of 7,000 and an average of 100, he met a poignant fate.
Hollis bowling and Don playing perhaps his last test innings here. The second bowler, Googly, got him. Well, it isn't often you get a big hand when you make a duck, but this was different.
No more would bowlers be faced with this apparently insoluble problem. So must ancient Italy have felt when she heard of the death of Hannibal, wrote Robertson Glasgow in Wisdom. That perceptive writer referred to Bradman as a business cricketer. There are no funny stories about the Don, he wrote. No one ever laughed about Bradman. He was no laughing matter. Has any champion batsman been a laughing matter? Certainly not the maker of mammoth scores whom Bradman overshadowed, Bill Ponsford, the only man to score 400 on 2 occasions. That laconic Victorian came into Test cricket with a century in 1924 and went out of it with an innings of 266 10 years later against England at the Oval. Not always painlessly or comfortably. Ponsford and his opening partner, Bill Woodfull, here on the left, became Australia's answer to Hobson Sutcliffe and broke almost as many bowlers' hearts. Woodfull was referred to as the unbowlable, and it took a patient, vigilant cameraman to film this. Woodfull was also a fine and popular captain, and not without a sense of humour.
On behalf of the 18th Australian 11, permit me to thank you most heartily for this wonderful reception that you have given us here today. 4 years ago, I had the privilege and the honour of answering to the toast in a similar function. And on that occasion, spread round the tables, there were a number of ashtrays. Inscribed upon the ashtrays, "We come for the ashes." About a fortnight after that function, the Journalists' Institute, I understand, received a bill for 52 ashtrays. Ladies and gentlemen, there were only about 18 Australians in the party.
Not the smoothest of styles, but Woodfull's value to Australia was inestimable in blunting the opening bowling attack before the stroke players came in. For elegance, few have matched Bill Brown, here with Jack Fingleton. Brown played one of Test cricket's more notable innings at Lord's in 1938, when he carried his bat through the Australian innings for 206 not out, having scored 133 at Trent Bridge in his previous Test innings. Fingleton was one of those batsmen with a will of iron. It was useful not only when facing the Larwood-Vos bodyline attack, but also to persuade an English crowd that loud barracking of slow batting would only cause play to cease altogether. Vic Richardson, a superb all-round sportsman, was another to show outstanding courage in weathering the bodyline attack. His major legacy to cricket, though, came through his daughter, whose sons were the Chappell brothers. Then there was Arthur Chipperfield, who came so close to making a century in his first Test against England. Reached 99, had a nervous, foodless lunch, and then... "29 times Don Bradman passed through the 90s in Test cricket, and not once did he fail to reach his century." Well, it may be thought unfair to compare others with Bradman. That was precisely the practice throughout his 20 years in charge, and for some considerable time afterwards. England's rising power was a soldier's son who first played for Gloucestershire in 1920, the summer of his 17th birthday. Walter Hammond, Wally Hammond, was 25 years old when he went to Australia in 1928-9 with Percy Chapman's side, and there made a string of Test scores which, like Bradman's of a year later, demand to be recited. It was a slow start, 44 and 28 at Brisbane, but then 251 at Sydney, 200 and run out, 32 at Melbourne, 119 not out, 177 at Adelaide. And then in the second Melbourne Test, where Australia pulled one back from 4-0 down, 38 and 16. Walter Hammond's aggregate for the 28-9 series was 905, his average 113, which gave Englishmen something to applaud, Australians something to ponder, and the emergent arch-competitor, Don Bradman, something to attack. Hammond made 167 centuries, 22 of them for England, including this one at his favourite ground, Sydney. And his scores included the then world record Test score of 336 not out with 10 sixes, made in New Zealand immediately after the bodyline tour. His final career aggregate of 7,249 runs was a Test record for many years. In 1927, he'd become the first batsman apart from W.G. Grace to score 1,000 runs actually in the month of May. Thereafter, records came to him with deceptive ease. He was relaxed of movement, but full of power. Just the kind of athlete any young man would wish to be. Of countless commanding innings, his 240 at Lord's against Australia in 1938 was perhaps the greatest. From a score of 31 for 3, he quite simply took control, as he so often did, of a fraught situation. It was the perfect captain's innings. Of those who played full seasons, Hammond stood astride the national batting averages in all 7 summers preceding the Second World War. His cover drive, the classical model. His reliability, a cricketing Bible. On the grounds of England and overseas, he was the champion, even if W.G. Grace had patented the title. and the master, even if Hobbs, now retired, had made that affectionate nom de guerre his own. Denzil Baxter spoke of Walter Hammond's proconsular presence. At times that seemed almost an understatement, as he turned even the fierce place of Ted MacDonald and the twisting menace of Grimmitt into child's play. He did nothing for his reputation by continuing in the difficult years following the war, although he went to Australia with hope. Glimpses of the champion of old were there at times.
The best performance was Hammond's imperturbable innings of 208. His first 100 took 3 1/4 hours, his second an hour and 3/4. The MCC scored 477, but it was lucky for them that while others left, their captain stayed on and made sure of a first innings lead.
Thereafter it was the haven of the press box, and eventually hard times and obscurity in South Africa, a tragic decline for a British sporting monument. To share Hammond's battles on England's behalf during the 30s, there was a galaxy of batting talents, some northern, some southern, some amateurs, some hardened professionals. None fought more dourly nor capably than Maurice Leyland, the Yorkshireman whose left-handed imperturbability disturbed Australia's Tiger Bill O'Reilly more than any other. His neighbour, Eddie Painter from Lancashire, was called up less frequently, but he averaged 59 in 20 test matches. He fell leg before for 99 against Australia at Lord's. There was never a more popular batsman than that cheery Cockney Patsy Hendren, who made 170 centuries in his 32 years at the crease. 7 of his hundreds were made for England, and all after his 35th birthday. The popularity of this unpretentious little man raised his status to that of the cartoon subject. Leslie Ames of Kent and England became the only wicket-keeper to register 100 centuries, 8 of them in test matches.
Ames shares the honours. Here is his 100, the first test century for the world's finest stumper batsman. The England innings closes for 440, a mighty score after being 130 for 4.
Dilip Singh, the second Indian to play for England, graceful as his uncle Ranji, made an exquisite century in his maiden test and would have gone further but for poor health. The Nawab of Pataudi, the third Indian to play for England, scored a debut century like the other 2 when he captained his native India after the war. He bequeathed his skills to his son Tiger, who entered international cricket in the 1960s. Pataudi Jr. was the youngest of Test captains. His career was sadly interrupted by the loss of an eye in an accident, but he still managed to enchant. No stylist in the 30s excelled C.F. Walters of Worcestershire in England.
Now Walters gets going. It's a 2. Oh, well hit. Walters gets Grimmitt away into the country. Both batsmen are well set. Sutcliffe looks safe as a house, and Walters is scoring at a rattling pace. Well hit, Walters. That sends the 50 up in less than an hour.
An elegant captain and an artist among cricketers. For determination and courage, which often counted for more than style in the intensity of test match combat, Bob Wyatt earned admiration, if not ecstatic applause. Much applause awaited the brilliant Fred Bakewell, a prolific scorer for Northants, but a tragic car accident forced his retirement. A similar fate befell another game opener from that county a third of a century later. Colin Milburn, even broader of beam than Maurice Leyland, was beginning to mature into that most precious of commodities, a responsible entertainer, when the loss of an eye ended his playing days when he was only 27. The 1930s produced no more intriguing cricketer than Douglas Jardine, the cool cricketing intellectual of Oxford, Surrey and England, who commanded the bodyline operation. That assured his immortality, some might say infamy, at the cost of his reputation as a batsman of high discipline.
We'll tell you some more about it in a week's time and some more still after the test match here.
Australians would have relished the sight of Jardine facing up to one of his own terror bowlers, Bose, in a county match. Charlie Barnett, Hammond's Gloucestershire colleague, Harold Gimlett, Paul Gibb, Arthur Fagg, the only batsman to score 2 double centuries in the same match, the elegant Joe Hardstaff of Notts, epitomised the generation cheated by the loss of the war years.
Any true and lasting impact by the newer test-playing countries had to await the years following the Second World War. Nevertheless, there were quality batsmen from those countries, and none carried a heavier burden so independently and successfully as Jamaica's George Headley. In England and Australia, they called this wonderful little batsman the Black Bradman. At home in the Caribbean, they tended to think of Bradman as the White Headley. He was the first to invalidate the old credo that white man bat, black man bowl. And despite the flow of batting talent to emerge from West Indian territory since the war, Headley, the brave and inventive boy from Panama, still stands alone. Clifford Roach, on the right here, scored the first century in Test cricket for West Indies, and his partner, Ivan Burrow, scored the first for West Indies in England at Manchester in 1933. But one West Indian batsman stands out as the most exciting all-round cricketer of the period, perhaps of all time. Leary Constantine, fast bowler, electric-heeled fielder, batsman who could swing the course of a match in half an hour's frantic stroke play.
South Africa's runs were generally made by correct, thoughtful batsmen like Bruce Mitchell. He was still his country's leading scorer with almost 3,500 runs, when international isolation was imposed on South Africa in 1970. Dudley North, son of a Test cricketer, hit a superb 231 against Australia in Johannesburg in 1935, and was still good enough to make a double century with a broken thumb against England 15 years later. Alan Malva provided grace and elegance to please the purists. Eric Dalton made some breezy contributions to South African performance. Ken Fillion some determined ones, with the solid Jack Seedley. The combative, witty Eric Ryan was a hard man to dig out.
The father of New Zealand cricket was Tom Lowry, portly and past his best when his country was given Test status. Then came Stuart Dempster, a highly gifted and uncoached player who averaged 65 in Test matches. He made New Zealand's first Test century. But by 1937, the Kiwis were ready to give the world one of the finest left-handers of all, Martin Donnelly, then only 19. After the war, he showed his rare ability in university, county and Test cricket. And the prolific Bert Sutcliffe set new levels of excellence, making the highest score ever by a New Zealander, 385.
Len Hutton and Dennis Compton were strongly contrasting players and characters. Hutton, the apparently fragile, quiet, pale Yorkshireman, went in at number 1, and he withstood the shock and fire of Australia's new ball attack. Compton was the popular figure, the laughing extrovert from Middlesex, the footballer cricketer who played like a boy and won the hearts of men and women, the dashing hero to Hutton's suffering artist-scientist. Len Hutton's mentor in the 1930s was that coolest of opening batsmen, Herbert Sutcliffe. The young Hutton's apprenticeship was thorough and at times savage. Here, early in his career and at the start of an innings, Larwood breaks through him with a quick one. And all his career, Len planned and strove to avoid that early dismissal, and it didn't happen very often. Nevertheless, in his first Test match, the New Zealander Jack Cowie bowled him out for naught. Still, the next season, 1938 at Trent Bridge, he scored a century in his first appearance against Australia. And in the 5th Test of that same 1938 series, he staggered the cricket world and indeed his own constitution by batting for 13 hours for a new Ashes record score of 364. And Don Bradman, whose 334 now became second best, was the first man to congratulate him.
Those minutes before Hutton smashed the record were charged with drama, but the crowd had come prepared for a long stay. Then he broke the record.
Today, I think, has been one of the happiest days of my cricketing career. I managed to beat Don's great record, and I must say I felt very pleased when I achieved it.
10 years later, his left arm an inch shorter after a wartime accident, Hutton witnessed the other extreme as England were bowled out for 52 at the Oval. He was first in and last out and top scorer with 30. The most renowned of his opening partners was Cyril Washbrook, the rugged Lancastrian with whom he made 359 for England's first wicket against South Africa in Johannesburg. The unluckiest of his partners probably was Jack Robertson, a polished batsman from Middlesex who seldom let England down in his restricted Test career. There was Reggie Simpson of Nottingham, as composed as any batsman who ever padded up, a stylist, cool and easy with the bouncer. John Langridge, no batsman until 1982, made as many runs, over 34,000, and still was never capped by his country. Hutton was dropped only once in his Test career, when in 1948 it was thought that a rest from the Australian bumper barrows might be beneficial. Otherwise he was a fixture, and a revered fixture at that. He was recognised as the supreme technician, an artist whose work pleased even those who usually concerned themselves about scoring rates. His deep sense of responsibility, especially when he became the first English professional Test captain of modern times, weighed heavily on his spare shoulders. With the captaincy came the fulfilment of his dream, that England might reassert herself against the all-conquering Australians. He not only led England to a joyous, long-awaited victory in the Ashes decider at the Oval in 1953, but he commanded the campaign that retained the Ashes in Australia in 1954-55. Soon afterwards, Len Hutton retired. He was battered, weary, and worn. His monarch bestowed a knighthood upon him. There had long been a king himself in the hearts of his loyal legions. Dennis Compton played a little longer, despite the loss of a kneecap.
Well, how is it, Dennis? Well, I'm very fit indeed at the moment, Mr. Brown, and I'm sure my knee's going to stand up very well to this trip.
For several sunny summers, he was part of a phenomenal double act. He and Bill Edrich actually scored only a little under 7,500 runs between them in the 1947 season. Edrich made a dozen centuries, Compton 18, 2 more than Hobbs in his record summer of 1925. Compton's aggregate of 3,816 beat Hayward's record of 1,906. Small wonder that men and boys who watched them coin runs at will still become wide-eyed at the memory of that season. They both did wonderful things for England in 1948. Edrich made a century at Leeds, and Compton 2 splendidly heroic hundreds. The first at Trent Bridge, when a Miller bumper in poor light finished him at 184. The next at Old Trafford, when a ball from Lidwell split his eyebrow early in the innings. He came back after a few stitches and a slug of brandy and scored an unbeaten 145. As in the days of Grace and the young Bradman, people came to watch a specific performer when Dennis Compton was playing. It went back to his first Ashes Test in 1938, when, only 20 years old, he made 102, and reached its climax when he made the winning hit as England regained the Ashes after 19 years. Like all popular champions, he was, his admirers felt, completely irreplaceable. After the war, Australia had a high-class opening pair in Sid Barnes and Arthur Morris, right hand and left hand. Solid, patient, brave as was necessary against the muted attacks offered up by the other countries. Barnes finished higher than Bradman in the 1948 Test averages, and so did Morris, who made 3 centuries. Another post-war newcomer, one of the most exciting of all cricketers, was ex-airman Keith Miller, a chivalrous, warring player in the Jack Gregory mould. His fast bowling and slip fielding were electrified, but his batting, if he could have concentrated on it alone, might have lifted his name into the top 10 for all cricket history. Joining Miller in 1947-48 and adding neat power to the Australian batting was the left-hander Neil Harvey, was soon testing the pundits in their comparisons with Clem Hill and Warren Bardsley of old. The last Australian batsman to span pre- and post-war tests was the whimsical Lindsay Hassett, who had the unenviable job of following Don Bradman as captain. His humour as well as his resourceful batting saw him through. The 1950s and 1960s saw the emergence of a solid, courageous Colin MacDonald and Jim Burke on the left here. Then came Norman O'Neill, all nerves and crashing power. An equally strong stroke player was Peter Burge. None was more dedicated than Ken Mackay, the slasher. Richie Benno took over the captaincy and became far more than a major spin bowler. Brian Booth, also sometime captain of Australia, was a cool, elegant cricketer. And Bob Cowper, the thoughtful Victorian left-hander, amazed the cricket world by making 307 against England in 1966. Another left-hander who dropped instantly into place in the cauldron of Test cricket was the lanky, long-nosed Bill Lawry. Ian Redpath, another batsman whose patience helped brand the 1960s a decade of attrition and of falling attendances. There was, though, still elegant and charming cricket to be seen, as in the batsmanship of Paul Sheehan. Bob Simpson succeeded Benno as captain of Australia. With a sound basic technique and extraordinary application, Simpson made himself a high-scoring Test opener. Now, historically, continuity of great batsmanship remains unbroken. And as age and injury gradually erased the names of some great players from the score sheets, so two young cricketers from the university engaged the selector's attention. The one from Oxford was called Colin Cowdrey, the one from Cambridge, Peter May. Willie Watson, the stylish Yorkshire left-hander, saved the Lord's Test of 1953 against Australia and, as it proved, won the series. His partner in that epic rescue operation was the legendarily obdurate Trevor Bailey. Has there ever been a more astounding Test recovery than England's against West Indies at Edgbaston in 1957? England saw the new flowering of its batsmanship in May and Cowdrey stand firm through a partnership of 411. Peter May was one of the finest batsmen in the world during the 35 years following the Second World War. He refused, fairly understandably, to continue into middle age. There were reasons: illness, the lure of a business career. Perhaps most of all, the criticism following one catastrophic dismissal in a crisis, bowled for a duck by Benno. Cowdrey, on the other hand, carried on until he was 42. Unlike May, he often made ordinary bowling look lethal. His gentler nature and inclination to overthink caused him to change his methods, sometimes even when things were going well. Nevertheless, his record is heavy with achievement and with honours. Tom Graveney, whom the selectors never seemed to trust for any protracted period, was a model of ease and flowing precision. His 47,000 post-war runs and 122 centuries argue against the view that he was no man for a crisis. Dexter preferred the direct approach, upright, imperious, the personification of ruthless power. Dexter was another who gave up Test cricket prematurely, for family and business reasons. But Ken Barrington, a man whose health was ruined by the intense demands of international cricket in the 60s, struggled on through 82 Test matches, scoring 20 centuries. This isn't Dr. Grace. It's England's outwardly grim battler of the 1960s, Ken Barrington. Seen here with Don Kenyon, Peter Richardson, scorer of England's slowest Test century, proved a capable opener, even if his weakness outside the off stump led to his being caught by the wicketkeeper in all 8 Test innings against Australia in 1956. The Reverend David Shepherd found time between ecclesiastical studies to represent England 22 times. And Raman Subbarao began and ended with centuries against Australia, all in one season, 1961. Jeff Noddy Puller did service for England in his own phlegmatic, relaxed way. Mike Smith, bespectacled, scholarly, a man of few words. And here are three stylish, aggressive players. Peter Parfitt, Bob Barber and Eric Russell. West Indies gathered its power, tightened its game and began winning matches. Stollmeyer and Ray provided a solid opening, and then came the famous 3 Ws from Barbados. Everton Weekes, a murderer of bowling. Clyde Walcott, a crusher of bowling. And Frank Worrell, all grace and ease, a leader as well as a high-scoring batsman. West Indies' first regular black captain. Then came arguably the greatest all-round cricketer of them all, from Barbados, christened Garfield, known as Gary. G.S. Sobers broke the World Test record when he was only 21. That was at Kingston, Jamaica in 1958, when he made 365 not out against Pakistan. After that, he took his test figures to amazing levels. 8,032 runs with 26 centuries, 235 wickets with pace and spin, and 109 catches in his 93 tests. He was never less than exciting to watch, and his manner was that of a cricketing aristocrat. He was the first, and he's still the only, man to have hit 6 sixes in a 6-ball over. And like his father figure, Worrell, he was recognised with a knighthood at the end of his career. There was a blend of art and infallibility about Garfield Sobers' splendid stroke play.
I really doesn't concentrate on records or average, as one might think. I just play the game, and whatever comes along, comes along.
Sobers might have been accompanied through his 20 years of dominance by Collie Smith from Jamaica, who scored 4 exciting centuries in his 26 test matches, but he was killed in a car crash in 1959. Sobers' chief ally through those great West Indian years was Rowan Canhire of Guyana and Warwickshire. Conrad Hunt gave that side a solid opening. In the middle order came Seymour Nurse, a mighty batsman, and Basil Butcher, neat, quick on his feet. From South Africa, in succession to Russell N. Dean and Jackie McGlue, the cavalier Roy McLean, and the steady John Waite, came a match-winning generation headed by Graham Pollock, who vividly recalled Frank Woolley in his style and who matched Sobers stroke for stroke on the precious occasion when they batted together for the rest of the world in 1970. Decisive footwork, early assessment, quick into position, a clean, powerful stroke play, and he combined all the natural gifts of fine batting. In 7 memorable hours at Durban in 1970, those gifts produced South Africa's highest test innings, Graham Pollock's 274 against the Australians.
Dennis Lindsay, one of the finest wicketkeeper batsmen, hammered 3 centuries against Australia in the series 4 years earlier. And Eddie Barlow, a fighting cricketer, averaged 45 in his 30 tests. But the 2 Springboks who were to make the greatest impact on world cricket in the 70s were Mike Proctor, who matched Jessup with his hurricane and pure hitting, besides his fierce and fast bowling, and Barry Richards, who, when he chose, seemed able to make runs freely off any type of bowling. He once scored 356 for South Australia in a Sheffield Shield match in Perth.
India had some high-scoring batsmen, especially in their domestic competitions. Mushtaq Ali, the tall stylist, Vijay Merchant, that infallible punisher, Rusi Modi, who once scored 7 centuries in 7 consecutive Ranji Trophy matches. Vijay Hazare was a useful bowler too. Lala Amarnath, who scored the first Test century for India. And that tireless all-rounder, Vinu Mankad. He, with Pankaj Roy, made a world Test record of 413 for the first wicket against New Zealand. The 1950s saw the batting skill, severely tested by English fast bowling, of Vijay Mandraker, a handsome stroke player, and the upstanding Polly Umrigar. Then came Chandu Borde and Dilip Sardesai, who had an outstandingly successful tour of West Indies. All the legatees of that tall military stroke maker, Colonel C.K. Naidu. The newest test-playing country, Pakistan, too, has contributed to this procession of great batsmen. Imtiaz Ahmed was the first regular wicketkeeper to score a Test double century. Towering above all the others, though, in his consistency and concentration, was the young marathon batsman Hanif Mohammed. First of all, he set the record for the length of an innings when he made 337 in a test in Barbados. He was at the crease for 16 hours and 10 minutes and exhausted everybody's patience with his own and caused anyone who'd ever managed to bat for even 3 hours to marvel at his stamina. Then, a year later, he broke Bradman's first-class record with an innings of 499. Now comes a change of generation, a period of tempo and of temper. Wartime babies are ready for test caps, and all at once test cricket finds itself in competition with one-day play. And vast sponsorship deals make it all at once a money game, especially after the intervention of Kerry Packer, the Australian businessman and television magnate. Let's look now at some of the players who dominated that 10-year period of flux. Two major England players, in fact, weren't English-born. Basil D'Oliveira, the Cape-coloured, wasn't allowed to play first-class cricket in South Africa, where he was born, but he qualified for England and averaged 40 in his 70 test innings. Many of them played under fierce pressure. And another from South Africa, though born into a relatively privileged environment, was Tony Greig, who rose to become captain of England, a thrustful leader and chief organiser of the breakaway Packer movement.
Yes, well, once the team had been picked, it was up to me when I came back to explain it to them and then for them to decide whether they wanted to sign. And in fact, as it turned out, not one single person who was approached turned the offer down.
Miss Amos's checkered career included some big hundreds, two of them over 200, against the high pace of West Indies. Brian Luckhurst, neat and brave, made 2 centuries against Australia with damaged hands. The rugged John Edrich became a pillar of reliability through 77 tests. His top score was 310 not out against New Zealand. But most significantly, 7 of his dozen test centuries were made against Australia. They saw in him the same fighting qualities the previous generation had recognised in his cousin Bill. Mike Brearley made fewer runs than he or his friends might have wished, but he was the captain of the decade, if not of the century, and he pioneered the batting moment. There were some unlikely popular heroes in the 1970s. David Steele, thoughtful looking in his spectacles, grey-haired at 33, who held up the England innings again and again in 1975 and 1976. Derek Randall, who almost suppressed his clowning instincts when he scored 174 in the Melbourne Centenary Test and 150 in 10 hours at Sydney 2 years later. John Jameson smoked and smiled like an Edwardian, even in the grim setting of modern Test cricket. McDonness was in a way an anti-hero, a Scot who for most didn't make enough runs as captain, though he finished with an average touching 40. Keith Fletcher was another who fell short of expectations. He thought deeply about the game and he could excite with his stroke play. Bob Woolman scored centuries in 3 consecutive home tests against Australia, the first of them the slowest ever made in an Ashes test match. Alan Knott, a magnificent wicketkeeper, also batted impishly, defiantly, unorthodoxly, and saved England more than once. One controversial figure ran almost like a theme through English batting for almost 20 years from 1964. That was the enigmatic Yorkshireman Geoffrey Boycott, who, with uncanny sense of occasion, scored his 100th first-class century in a test match at Headingley in his own county.
Yeah, it's magic, really. I would like to have done it here more than anywhere, in front of my own Yorkshire public. I mean, you can see the reception they've given me has been absolutely marvellous, but quite honestly, this is the sort of reception they've given me over my whole career, really.
Before he was excluded for taking part in an unauthorised tour of South Africa, Boycott had reached the summit of Test run-making. He'd overtaken Garfield Sober's 8,032. In domestic cricket, as he batted on through his 40s, he climbed further and further up the list of top aggregates, passing the illustrious names all the way.
So much of a world game had cricket become that in 1975 a World Cup was staged for the first time, with a mini World Cup for the smaller countries. Long gone were the days when England and Australia alone boasted all the batting talents in the universe.
West Indies won that first cup. Their captain, the languid giant left-hander Clive Lloyd, scored a crucial century to add to his many test match triumphs. Roy Fredericks, who made perhaps the fastest of all test centuries of 71 balls at Perth in 1975, was a fine stroke-making opener. So too was Gordon Greenidge, who made his runs fast and attractively for both West Indies and Hampshire. Lawrence Rowe put his name in the record books with a double century and a century in his first test match, and then a triple century against England. If injury hadn't interfered with his career, Jamaica might have given the world a true successor to George Headley. But Rowe made certain of his place in cricket history when he led the first and unofficial West Indies team on a tour of South Africa. Alvin Kallicharran batted delicately and skillfully, making runs for West Indies and Warwickshire and also in forbidden South Africa. Desmond Haynes, who matured into an impressive opening batsman, passed Clive Walker's West Indian record score in a Lord's Test. From 1976, one West Indian batsman stood out as rare and special. Viv Richards from Antigua sometimes made bowlers feel there was no orthodox way to get him out. He had poise, power and a voracious appetite for runs. He was inevitably compared with Bradman as he reeled off test centuries, taking apparent liberties, bruising fielders' hands, winning matches. Conditions and attitudes had changed immeasurably since the Bradman years, of course, yet it's hard to believe that a Grace, a Hobbs or a Hammond wouldn't prosper today, or that Richards would not have made thousands of runs in any era, to stand alongside those who've established their supremacy beyond question across the generations.
From Pakistan, walking the trail cut by Hanif, have come Majid Khan, Asif Iqbal, Hanif's young brother Mushtaq, the boy prodigy Javed Miandad, the wild one, Mudassar Nazar, maker of the slowest of all test centuries, Zahir Abbas, one of history's most passionately devoted makers of high scores, over 100 of them centuries, and the lyrical Mohsin Khan, whose double century at Lord's in 1982 was the first in a test match on that ground for 33 years.
From New Zealand, following John Reid, have come the batting talents of such as Graham Dowling, Bev Congdon, Mark Burgess, Vic Pollard, down into the era where they now find test victories less elusive. Batsmen like Jeff Howarth, John Wright, and the preeminently thoughtful Glenn Turner, whose career with Worcestershire took him massively to a century of centuries, only the second non-English batsman to perform that rare feat. For India, who began to win tests under Ajit Wadekar, good runs have come from Vengsarkar, the pocket-sized Viswanath, the high-spirited all-rounder Kapil Dev, the bold Sandeep Patil, but most of all from the resolute and tireless Sunil Gavaskar, who made 4 centuries in West Indies in his first test series at 21, and went on scoring hundreds off all the major countries, most of whom fielded bowling attacks twice as strong as his own. Australia, who started the 70s with the muscular opening batting of Stackpole, finished the decade with the waspish left-hander Graham Wood's 100 in the centenary test at Lord's. By then, the remarkable Doug Walters had reached the end of his erratically dazzling career, while the latter-day Woodfall Rick McCosker had made his tidy mark. And so too had the equally steady John Dyson. The backbone of Australian batting during those years, though, was unquestionably provided by the Chappell brothers. Ian, the elder, was a challenging batsman, a man who recognised an opponent's ploy and would meet it head-on rather than dodge it. There was never a more confidently aggressive captain. Greg Chappell, from his very first test innings, was obviously out of the classical mould. Cool, precise, clean in his execution of stroke. Like Dewliep and Archie Jackson, he often wasn't in complete health. But like those two batsmen, on his day, he could seem like one from another world while his batting partners struggled.
Many runs came to Australia from left-handers. from Rod Marsh, who was Australia's first wicketkeeper to make a century against England. David Hooks, whose half-century lit up the Melbourne Centenary Test, and in 1982 he hit the fastest Australian century, 43 minutes. Graham Yallop, whose hundreds against England came at breakneck speed. Alan Border, whose high scores in the 1981 Test matches came at a much lesser rate, as he took up the full weight of responsibility for Australia's wavering batsmanship in Greg Chappell's absence.
Kepler Wessels, South African born, made 162 in his first Test against England. Kim Hughes, the brilliant stroke maker from Western Australia, wrestled with the captaincy. His century at Brisbane in 1978 was the slowest until then by an Australian. More true to type was his audacious batting during the Centenary Test at Lord's. His eager, energetic batting held all the adventure and aggression of 100 years of Australian Test cricket. And what of English batting as it moved into the 1980s? The slender, artistic David Gower was boyishly carefree only in appearance, for his sense of responsibility, as gradually dawned on others, was very real.
Well, yes, you can't afford to have doubts, really. Like any part of the game. You've got to look at it positively, you've got to think that you can do it, be positive generally about the whole thing, and then just look forward to it.
Chris Tavares represented supreme patience and defiance, the underpinner of the innings in the Bailey boycott bowl. There was power play from the weighty bat of Graham Gooch, another to be banned for touring South Africa. Alan Lamb was born in South Africa of British parents, and England were glad of his positive stroke play in their time of batting need. The most vital component of all in England's national cricket, in an age of slackening over rates and protective helmets, was the young giant from Somerset, Ian Botham, striker of hour-long centuries and long, long sixes. The most consistent hitter since anybody you can think of. Botham might, for all we know, have been the most colossal smiter of them all. Intimidating in his attitude towards slow and medium bowlers, fearless against pace, he's always done the simple things well, and with an overriding strength that few found resistible. A boisterous, laughing cricketer, Botham generated a golden age of his own, reminding people what a bat was for, and that cricket was devised as a game to be enjoyed with purpose and a smile. They grew from eager, ambitious boys, learning their craft on privileged fields or in back streets, to become, in a way, publicly owned men. They built ladders out of runs and scaled them to the summit of the game. They strove for their countries and for personal pride while nations watched. They're immortalized in wisdom and on film, and the legacy they handed down is still accepted eagerly by the young men all over the world who in their turn must face and overcome the ever-mounting problems set by the bowlers, those huntsmen of cricket. Of course, records will still be broken, but as we've seen, there's more to batsmanship than mere statistics. So much more.
Popularity of cricket goes on increasing, and it is of course a matter of satisfaction to us who had a great deal to do with international cricket and with Lords, to find that the MCC and Lords are still looked to find 11s to visit various parts of the empire where test match cricket is played, and that our visitors regard playing in a match at Lords as their highest ambition. The ground has seen great changes since I first knew it nearly 70 years ago. When I first came up to Lords, members used to practice in the middle of the ground with a net behind the wicket at each end, with a net behind the wicket at each end, so that two members could practice at one time. Cricket, therefore, I hope, continues and will continue to be a great example
of how best to maintain an institution which is at the same time a pastime and affords a great moral lesson.